Well, I think I might go ahead and get started here. We might still have people trickling in as we often do, but that's okay. This is a big discussion, and so I want to give us plenty of time to talk about it. A couple of things. First, just to acknowledge we haven't done this in a few weeks. We're not exactly on a one-to-one track with the sermons and facing hard questions anymore, but that's okay. Glad to honestly have a little bit of break and breathing room from between one of these and another. The second thing I wanted to say is that this is different from any of the others that we've done so far. The first three sessions were really focused on the Bible and how we think about and interpret the Bible. This is really just something that comes up from the content of the Bible or of our faith. That is something that's typically called the problem of evil. And actually, that's a formal term, the problem of evil. It's a problem that's known well enough that it has its own kind of subfield of philosophy in the philosophy of religion dedicated to it. And it was perhaps one of the most classic ways that it was framed was by a Greek philosopher named Epicurus a long, long time ago. And he said it like this: if God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he's not omnipotent. If God is able, but not willing, then he's malevolent. If God is both willing and able to prevent evil, then where does evil come from? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? Pretty stinging critique. And so this has been recognized by a lot of philosophers and theologians as probably the most challenging aspect of any kind of monotheistic faith. We believe that there is a good God who is all-powerful and all-knowing, and also completely morally good. Then why in the world is there so much evil around us? That's the question. I think it's also important to acknowledge, though, that this is not just an intellectual question, that for many people it is a deeply personal and emotional one. I know personally and have heard of a number of people who maybe had faith at some point in their lives or were considering faith, and then went through some kind of tragic experiences in which they came face to face with just senseless suffering, and it convinced them that maybe it's not worth believing in God. This is sometimes expressed in literature, not just among Christians, but among Jews and Muslims. Elie Wiesel, the famous Jewish author who went through Auschwitz, famously talked about how his faith went up in flames in Auschwitz, which if there was ever a situation where you were face to face with evil, it's hard to imagine one much worse than the Nazi concentration camps. A number of different writers, even Christian writers like Fyodor Dostoevsky, have written very deeply and passionately about this issue. I think it's appropriate for us to kind of address it in a space like this, to kind of really wrestle through what the problem of evil is, how it affects us, ways that we might think about it or respond to it. But I also think it's important to be very careful about how we take something from a discussion like this and apply it to real life situations. Because oftentimes when people are talking about evil, even if they're just talking about it ostensibly from an intellectual perspective, there's baggage behind it. And to come too quick with the answers and the explanations in your thoughts can come across as dismissive or callous. And sometimes Christians trying to answer the problem of evil drives people away from the faith quicker than the evil itself. Okay, long preface. Before we jump into the actual content, let me just ask, is this something that you have wrestled with before personally? Is this something that that you know people of who have, it's been a big issue in their life? What comes to mind when you think about this discussion?
I think about this almost every day. It's a stumbling block for me.
And just in working in hospice, you hear it all the time.
Can you say any more about that, Ken? Like what kind of?
I mean, just in people wondering why God is allowing this, why God is doing this. I mean, and particularly when it's younger folks, but still, even with older folks,
yeah,
those questions are always there. And I never have a good answer. and I've learned not to try.
But how do you respond when they ask those questions?
I mean, a lot of it depends on how they ask the question and exactly what words they use in asking it. And this is not a good answer, but I'll just say, that's a question that people have struggled with for centuries, for thousands of years. And if it isn't a situation where I feel free to express just a little of my faith beliefs, I mean, even that I'm about to say it now sounds so trite, but just in saying that I don't understand either, but I just believe God is a good God. And yeah, it's like I said, I've been in hospice now for 20 something years and I still don't have a good answer. And especially when we are limited, as we should be, in how much of our own personal faith we can bring to a conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
I think right now, I mean, I've certainly had my own personal questions from my personal life that are related to that, but I don't know, reading Job this past week, every day, another chapter, it's almost like he's the voice of the people whose cries we're just now starting to really be paying attention to, which, I mean, I think it's just so painful to see how such horrible day-to-day suffering exists for all the kind of I don't want to say the wrong people, because I don't want to see anybody suffer, but it just shocks me how persistent the suffering is day in and day out for those who just, don't deserve it, and how that continues seemingly without end. I think it's not new, but it's certainly not better than ever before. And I mean, it's just that senseless suffering is in our faces really intensely right now. And I just hear Job expressing it. It's all in that. It's all in there. That suffering, that questioning, that agony, that how long, oh Lord, it's just articulated so well there. So.
Thank you. Are there any others who have had thoughts or experiences, even if they don't feel like you have to have a complete thought here, but thoughts or experiences or feelings, if you will, related to the problem of evil?
I guess I don't think that I ever remember believing that God really was omnipotent, and that God is in control of everything. And I just, for as long as I can remember, I've believed that there are a lot of negative things in life that are rather randomly distributed, and like cancer and other kinds of health issues, or natural disasters, or what we call natural disasters, or other things that harm people's lives. And so I've never blamed God for bad things that happen. I'm not sure why that is, but I'm grateful that I never felt that I needed to think that God was responsible.
In working with parents of children who are born with severe problems, sometimes incompatible with life, and I've been there at the bedside with those parents, and so often they would ask, why did this happen, and what did I do wrong? And I tried to reframe it by saying, you are such a good parent that if you could have kept it from happening, you would have. That, you're even asking that question shows that you would have done whatever you could to keep this from happening to your baby. That's a little off the track of what causes it. But I think one of the things that we tend to do, in addition to asking about God, is to say, what did I do wrong? I think when Mike was dying, he would often say, is God punishing me? Was I bad? And that was something that Frank really helped him work through right at the end, I believe.
Yeah, I think the kind of guilt that that Christians and Jews and people of faith often experience is kind of a unfortunate side effect of faith. Honestly, we believe that there is a moral reckoning in the universe. We know that we are flawed, and so then we wonder oftentimes if we're to blame. And I do think that there are several points when the Bible is clear that we are not to blame for different things. In particular, Jesus comments about a tower that fell on some people in Galilee and says, do you think this was God's punishment? No, it was not. But that trope is there in some parts of Scripture, and even if it wasn't, it seems to be human nature. I appreciate you kind of highlighting that, Jean.
I think there's a difference between putting the blame on God for the evil and wondering why God isn't doing something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, I think that's, for me, maybe the bigger question. Like with Brad, I don't ever put the blame on God. But I do. I can't. I continue to wonder about this intervening aspect and the whole role of prayer in all of that. In my personal story, and just thinking back to what Kim was sharing about people in hospice, when my dad was dying and he was only 58 and he was dying of cancer of the colon, and we had hospice. It was my first ever exposure to that whole thing of dying at home and all that. But I guess the question might have come up, why is this happening? I mean, it was like I don't know if that was really the biggest question. It didn't make it any easier. He was still a relatively young person and had so much ahead of him. there was a lot of prayer going on, a lot of people praying, a lot of really powerful prayer type people, you know, and if anybody could pray, they could, you know, and it still didn't help. Nothing changed it. So, you know, but again, you know, it's like, well, it wasn't a matter of why did God do this to my dad, you know. You could say, why didn't God do something to stop it? I don't know. But I mean, there's just such huge evils in the world that are just impossible to explain. And I mean, just what that officer could do to George Floyd. I mean, you know, something like, where does that evil come from? I mean, and how is God not stepping in to stop something from such a beautiful human being? You know, why doesn't God step in and not let this horrible thing happen? You know, but those things are happening all the time. We just don't happen to see them all. So I do think that's the other question is, why isn't God stepping in? But yet we believe at other times that God is stepping in, all the prayer, and then something good happens and we are praising God and so thankful. And I think it's a lot more complicated.
Just note that, yes, and prayer and intercessory prayer in particular, or petitionary prayer as it's sometimes called, is a related but also different issue that we might touch on today, but I don't think we're going to be able to get into all of the complexities of what it means to pray to an omniscient, omnipotent God to do something that you want or that you think is best, or how that works. Yeah. Well, feel free to keep commenting and sharing as we go. I think the way that I'm going to frame this is to try to look at it through a strictly philosophical lens and say that the way that philosophers of religion have really worked on this in kind of an intellectually vigorous way is that it has been framed as a syllogism. Okay, so a syllogism is like a logical argument. It's like kind of taking ideas and putting it almost in a mathematical formula, and such that if all of the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So people will construct this argument that says, you know, this is how we're thinking about the incompatibility of God and evil, and if all of these things are true, then we think that it proves that God does not exist. So I'm just going to go ahead and present a kind of a standard version of that, argument. I copied and pasted it into the chat, and I'm just going to read through it because I appreciate the way that it breaks this down. And then I want to note that people have responded to the problem of evil, or have argued back, or however you want to say it, defended faith by challenging one or more of these premises, these 6 premises. And in fact, all 6 have been challenged by some people of faith as being a misunderstanding of God or a false claim or something like that.
Thank you.
And so I think this will give us a good way of thinking about how we make sense of it and whether you agree with these or not, right? So I'm just going to go ahead through it and read it. So number 1, premise point 1, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. Point 2, if God is omnipotent, then God has the power to eliminate all evil. Point 3, if God is omniscient, then God knows when evil exists. Point 4, if God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil. Point 5, evil exists. Point 6, if evil exists and God exists, then either God doesn't have the power to eliminate all evil, or doesn't know when all evil exists, or doesn't have the desire to eliminate all evil. Point 7, therefore, God doesn't exist. Now, Brad already kind of started giving us a little window into this because we know where he gets off on this. His point of departure, he stated, would be point number 1. That he's not convinced that that claiming that God exists necessarily implies the claim that God is omnipotent, for example. I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Brad, or if that's an interesting point to start.
No, there's nothing I would add other than just I wouldn't get beyond number 1 because I don't agree with number 1. I don't agree that just for God to exist means that God has to be omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent.
Yeah, so let's kind of push back and say, some of this language, this precise language of omnipotent, omniscient, these are not terms that the Bible uses. These are kind of theological extrapolations from what we say about Scripture. But maybe to frame it in a little bit more biblical language, we could say that God is almighty, that God apparently had the power to create out of nothing and has a tremendous amount of power over the affairs of the world. So what would you see, Brad, as being the limits on that? Like, what keeps God from being able to say, take out Hitler as a baby so that, he doesn't grow up and lead genocide, or if not kill him, plant some ideas in his mind that would keep him from developing these kind of genocidal thoughts and plans?
Well, I think that God has chosen to limit God's self, and therefore chooses not to intervene. I think that I'm very much persuaded by science, and I think that science, both natural and social science, I think there's certain principles. I guess in natural science that we would call some of them laws, that are things that are always true, things that always happen or work in a certain way. And so I believe that God chooses not to interfere in the ways things usually work. Chooses not to interfere in a supernatural way, but allow things to follow their usual course.
I guess I would just comment that that's not an argument against omnipotence or omniscience. It's just an argument of choice. So I have the power to step on that bug if I want to. I am omnipotent in that regard. I choose not to. It doesn't take away my ability or my power or my nature. So I think to say God is not omnipotent because God chooses not to do something is not a logical argument.
And I think the question always is too, and someone else has mentioned it, maybe Sabrina mentioned it earlier, but does God choose at times to interfere? And then if he does, if you answer yes to that question, then you're back to the question of why does he choose one thing one time and another?
Yeah, and I might, go ahead, please.
And I also think there's maybe a question too when we say if God exists, when we say God, are we implying a personal being that relates personally to the creation?
Fair question. so some of that might just be a question of frame, and some of it is a little bit of an argument, right? Who are you, a questioner, to think that you can put God in a box? I think that typically speaking, this argument is, although it's framed in general terms, it's directed primarily at monotheistic faiths that do see God as kind of being a personal being in some ways, which is why you get point one, right? There would be people of other faiths. I mean, the ancient Greeks who might believe in Zeus would be like, "What are you talking about?" You know, like they're not morally perfect. They don't know everything. But you know, I think the monotheistic faiths are what you have in mind. But there is some validity in saying, now hang on a second, we are evaluating God in kind of human terms, and is that really appropriate here? And I want to come back to that in a minute, but I want to spend a little bit more time with this thought about omnipotence and this good discussion that's come up, because I'd say that there are a few different ways to think about this. So there is a sense that maybe God is self-limiting, you know, in which case you would not say that God is, or you could say, you know, God is choosing to honor free will, as opposed to God is stopped by free will. But there is, in response to point number two, this comment that if God is omnipotent, then God has the power to eliminate all evil. There are some legitimate questions about what omnipotence means, right? So one of the classic ways of kind of challenging the notion of omnipotence is to say, is God powerful enough to create a boulder that even he can't pick up? Right, and sorry for the gendered language. I'll use some female gendered language to balance it out before our discussion's over. But you know, is God powerful enough to create a boulder that even he can't pick up? Well, if you say yes, right, then you've limited. You know, if God has the power to do this, then you've limited God, because God can't pick up the boulder. But if you say no, that God can't do this, then that seems to put an inherent limit on omnipotence. So some people would argue that omnipotence itself has to be bound by, for example, the laws of logic, or the intrinsic nature of God. And they might view free will as a kind of boulder that God has created that even she can't move, if that makes sense. That God has made the choice to create humans who have, that there's this self-limiting that falls within the bounds of omnipotence. Take it or leave it. I mean, that's a way to think about it anyway. Give you all a chance to respond to that if you want, or to go in a different direction if you're ready.
Well, I think, you know, we probably can't fully understand what it means to say that God made us in God's image. But whatever that means, it means that we have quite a bit of capacity, capability of doing things. And I would think that includes the fact that we have the capacity to make faulty decisions. And God has chosen to permit that to happen. Otherwise, we would not God would not respect us as moral agents.
Yeah, that's an argument from choice, really. That kind of that's connected to, I'd say, point number 6. Um, and I want to get there too. Before I do, just give anybody else a chance to respond to this. And I just want to say kind of the difference between points 1 and 2. If you really go deep into it, this discussion about omnipotence and what it means was really developed the most deeply in the late Middle Ages. Some of that scholastic stuff that we scoff at now is oftentimes where the deepest thinking went on some of these issues. And I mean, I think that there's these questions that emerged as to whether God is bound by, for example, the rules of logic or not. Because if God created and surpassed even logic, then that makes the problem even worse. Because then, well, maybe God can give us free will and completely dictate our. Now we say, no, that's not possible. But I mean, if God did set the rules of logic, then why not? I mean, God could do anything. But there would be a pushback from the Thomists that would say, no, there's even language in scripture that says God cannot deny himself, right? And so God's own intrinsic nature, which is to be good, to be loving, to be truthful, and all the implications of what that contains, carry the implicit limits that need to frame the way that we think even about omnipotence. Any other comments about that before? I do want to move on to some of these other responses, including this idea of God choosing not to intervene, and this idea of who are we to even judge God in this way.
Well, I guess there's just the one question about where did evil start in the first place? So we're talking about evil in this syllogism as something separate from all the rest of it, right? So we're making an assumption that there's this evil, there's God, and then there's evil. God exists, evil exists, God doesn't exist, evil, you know. So that's making a certain assumption right there, which creates a problem, I think.
Yeah, and I think that would be a way of pushing back against point number 5, I think, in a certain way. This claim that evil exists, that seems pretty straightforward, but it's worth saying, now hang on a second, what do you mean by evil? Do you or does anybody want to say what you think? I mean, when you think about evil, what is it? Where does it come from? How do you make sense of its presence?
Well, I think of it from a physics point of view, kind of, because of my education, in that God created matter, and
Energy.
and then within the world there's also antimatter. So, I mean, it's the antithesis. But all of our universe, in a sense, has a balance of for and against built into it. I'm just saying it's kind of pervasive in the whole physical thing. That's all. I'm not. It doesn't really explain it, I guess, but.
No, there's philosophical merit to what you're saying there, Jim. I mean, the idea is that, you know, how would you know what light is, or how could light have existence if there's not darkness? How could you know what love is if there wasn't the freedom to not love, right? So this is kind of the idea that evil, whether it's as an entity or as a possibility, kind of had to be built into the system in order for good to exist by way of contrast. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think about suffering. Evil is sort of a big category. And when you put evil in God, you're talking about sort of big, almost absolute things. But I don't think there's anything evil about a volcano, and yet it can cause a lot of suffering. I don't know that there's anything evil about a cancer, and yet it can cause tremendous suffering for the person and for their loved ones. There is evil that we do to each other, directly or indirectly. The way we're treating the planet is a way of mistreating each other and our nest. But it doesn't feel to me like lumping all of this together and say, why do bad things happen to good people, or why do bad things exist? It isn't, to me, all the same question.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking the same thing around the coronavirus, because in your sermon, Brian, you had said, we don't say that God caused the pandemic. And that, yeah, but did God create the coronavirus? So that's kind of, I think the same thing about, the cancer, volcano, things that contribute to great suffering. I think it's possible or likely that God created the coronavirus, depending on how you want to talk about that scientifically, but if it's people who are given, let's see, it kind of seems to me like if we were to follow the path that God has put before us in terms of how to behave in the face of something like a coronavirus, we wouldn't have the pandemic we have now. So if the motivations of those people who were preventing knowledge of the virus because of whatever greed or issues of power or whatever that was enabling that virus to start to spread and wreak havoc throughout the planet, it's acts like that it took the kernel of something that we see as something negative, but it doesn't have to be. But it was, in part at least, human bad intentions on the part of humans to allow that to happen. But I'd be interested to know, because do we think of the coronavirus as something evil? If it's evil, did God make it? How far back does the evil go? And
yeah, I think those are great points and questions. There's a valid critique of this, that it's too imprecise. And to your point, Martha, I think the direction that philosophy has actually moved in recent years is not addressing it in this kind of vague, abstract way, but in addressing more particular versions of the argument. Something that would say that, well, if God loves us, then God would not want us to undergo unnecessary suffering. And if God is powerful, then God has the power to relieve unnecessary suffering. And there is suffering out that doesn't contribute to any greater good. Therefore, God does not love us. That might be a more precise form of the argument, and one that gets a little more personal, when you talk about it in abstract terms. That's a little easier to frame it this way. I think I'm just going to comment here about this point 6 that says, if evil exists and God exists, then God doesn't have the power to eliminate all evil, or doesn't know when evil exists, or doesn't have the desire to eliminate all evil. This is an argument that a Christian philosopher several decades ago now, named Alvin Plantinga, really took on and wrote. There was an atheist who wrote a paper. I have to consult my notes, and I might not even have it here. But an atheist who wrote a paper named J.L. Mackie that argued essentially this. And Plantinga wrote a very robust, logical defense that did something very rare in the world of philosophy, and that was kind of ended the debate. Like, people kind of agreed that Plantinga's critique was fundamentally right. And this doesn't mean that atheist philosophers stopped arguing the problem of evil. They continued to do so, but kind of in the more precise, reformulated ways that Martha and Sabrina were alluding to. But Plantinga essentially argues that, look, when you make this argument that God either doesn't have the power to eliminate evil, or doesn't know, or doesn't want to, then you're not considering the possibility that there may be quote unquote greater goods at stake, right? Or there may be other reasons beyond our comprehension for allowing evil to continue to exist. So to reframe it in a trite kind of way, if you replaced evil with Barbies and God with me, I think the first replacement is easier to buy than the second one. But you could read this as saying, if Barbies exist and Brian exists, then either Brian doesn't have the power to eliminate all the Barbies from his house, or he doesn't know where all the Barbies exist, or he doesn't have the desire to eliminate all the Barbies. Well, actually, all those things are true. I have the power to eliminate the Barbies from my house, and I know where the Barbies exist, and I have the desire to get rid of the Barbies. If all of those things lined up, I would do them. And yet, because I know that my daughter likes her Barbies, I don't do it. So there is this kind of sense that maybe this argument at point 6 doesn't quite hold. Now, what that could be, like, what could this greater good possibly be that God would allow things as horrific as hundreds of years of racism and things like the Holocausts and diseases that just wipe out entire populations to exist, is pretty hard to imagine. And so that's kind of the direction where the argument has gone. But at least as a formal argument, very few philosophers today would still stick to this form. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think you're talking about a lot of these things when you were doing number 6, and the Barbie example, it's free will and choice. You chose not to eliminate the Barbies because you wanted to respect the free will of your daughter. And now that the daughter I have is 31, I could eliminate all the Barbies, You don't even know with some of these evolutions of racism is that people themselves, there's a movement, they want to get rid of it. The free choice movement, the free will, that humans want to get white and black are standing side by side is powerful, I think, rather than to a long time ago. I don't know. It's just where God created us with free will. And the evolution, do we in our free will want to move more like God and his choices? I think makes it look a little different.
Yeah, I think that, go ahead. Is somebody else commenting, or am I hearing myself echo here? Okay, I think that both you and Brad are making this point that like this free choice is something that God deeply, deeply values. It's something that that is a ultimate good. I think that there are people who have experienced evil who would disagree, who would say, nope, it's not worth it. I would rather not have free will, or at least have my free will tampered with, if not totally removed, than experience the kind of evil that that I've experienced, or that exists in the world. And this kind of gets us a little bit to point number, kind of something that Kim was mentioning earlier, and which becomes even a little bit more urgent now, is this question of like, who are you to judge? Like, what standards are we using even to judge something? And so, like the big response to point number 4. If God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil. Well, I don't know of anybody who argues, no, God actually does desire for there to be evil. But I do know of a large tradition, in fact, that would say that statement doesn't even make sense. Like, you can't, you're anthropomorphizing God to a ridiculous degree, that God is the very definition of that which is good. And so to think that we can evaluate God by saying, I consider this suffering, for example, to be evil because it's inconvenient to me, well, who are you to question? Why does your perspective of what is evil count against God? And this is kind of ultimately where the book of Job ends up. And spoiler alert, sorry for those of you who are still reading through Job, but the book of Job, ultimately God gives this big long speech that says, like, look, you don't know what it is to be God, and it is beyond your comprehension, but I am good. And Job is satisfied with that. But I think for a lot of people, that is not only an unsatisfying, but it's an infuriating answer, right? Like, it's this idea that it's just this it feels like this dogmatic non-answer, that, okay, well, then your faith is just this self-contained thing, and you're not going to let anything challenge it if you just keep coming back to this point of, well, nobody can question God, and therefore anything that happens is justified, is okay. Any thoughts? Any responses to that argument? Is that something that resonates with you? Is that something that frustrates you? What do you think?
I don't like to be told not to question. I've seen it said in a different way. People talk about the metaphor of a tapestry, and we can't see the whole picture, and therefore we don't really understand how what's happening now fits into the bigger picture, and therefore I guess we should just shut up and put up with it. But I'm of a divided mind on this, because there's a part of me that says, who are we to think that God needs to fit into our little philosophical questioning? But on the other hand, I think, there's a strong biblical and post-biblical tradition of arguing with God that I will stand up for. And in fact, even though God sort of said, who are you to question me? God didn't say, you were wrong, you were bad, you're going to be punished some more because you questioned. And God can handle our questioning.
It's good. Other thoughts?
Thomas has always been my favorite disciple.
And let me just say the argument that I presented, it is often associated with kind of a maybe a moral attitude, like you shouldn't question, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, it can just be a formal argument that says, like, look, you can ask the questions all you want, but your questions are philosophically wrong. Like you cannot. It's not accurate to be able to put God in a frame where you judge God morally, when God is in the theistic, monotheistic faith, the very basis of morality. Like that doesn't work like that. That's to kind of turn God into a human person or something like that, subject, and then to evaluate that subject from standards that you think you're getting from God. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that either, but just to say, it doesn't have to necessarily be a criticism of those who ask questions, but for a number of people, it it can be.
Thought that cross. No, go ahead.
Shall not the judge of all the earth be just?
It occurs to me that if the book of Job is to be taken as factual history, that God thought it worthwhile simply to prove a point to inflict, to allow all this evil to happen. I mean, not that he inflicted it, but allowed it to happen simply to prove a point. It was that greater good was simply to establish truth.
Yeah, that's pretty disturbing, right? Like, especially if you, I mean, I think that most people believe that the book of Job was composed in stages, and that the little narrative part at the beginning and the end might have been composed separately or attached later from the big dialogue part in the middle, and that kind of helps explain some of the tension between it. But it is a little bit disturbing. You hear this strong statement from God, and Job, this 5 chapter long speech about how you can't understand my ways, and then this depiction of God in Job chapter 1, in which God is almost in this kind of seemingly petty debate, and the reasons that God seems to be referring to are they seem silly and not deep and profound. And I think that what this reinforces what I've been trying to say about Scripture all along. I don't think that it's necessarily a flaw in Scripture. I just think that for God to try to communicate herself to us, she has to talk down to us, right? We have to use metaphors. We have to use he or she. We have to, or it, or, you end up thinking of God like an amorphous blob, is what C.S. Lewis would say. Like
it's a he.
And
when she about it.
Okay. And I think whenever you think about God in these ways, it reduces, it limits, it gets something wrong, and it becomes something that you can criticize, but it also gives access and a way to think about God. And so there's this kind of constant back and forth where we need these stories, we need these kind of imperfect God talking down to our language, and then we need to be reminded again that God is beyond our comprehension, and that these stories are giving us glimpses, not absolute understandings of what God is like, if that makes sense.
I think there's also a connection here, the question of evil with the question about what is God's will. And like, I think it might relate back to what, you were preaching about with the story of Joseph. and how the actions of the brothers might have had the intention of bad, but God used it for the intention of good. And then question is, well, did God arrange for all of that to happen the way it did so that this other thing could happen? Or did God do something with the situation after it happened? And I think that's kind of a different God, because I mean, some of the things that have been coming up in this discussion have brought that, you know, that phrase, does the end justify the means kind of thing? Like, are we looking at suffering and say, you know, that's like when somebody dies and somebody else says, oh, well, it must have been God's will, you know, or whatever. And well, I don't know. I mean, maybe if something good comes out of all of this in the end, you know, but I don't know if that's what God is doing. You know, all of the things that are happening now in response to the death of George Floyd, or, you know, if the whole healthcare system finally gets drastically improved, because we see now all of the discrepancy or all of the injustice against the communities of color and poverty, and you know, so that now people will finally see how unjust it is and do something about it. So maybe it's all okay, you know. Maybe God did this, you know. And I just think I think there's a relationship there. I think it's a different way of thinking about God. Are these things happening because God has a greater good plan ahead, and so all these things are going to turn out to be something good? Or is this all happening for a variety of reasons, evil being a part of it, and then God is in the situation working with all this suffering and all this, you know, misery, and finding constantly, moment by moment, ways to transform it into something redemptive? You know, does that make sense? Or, I mean, are we saying the ends justify the means, or are we saying God is still in the means and the end is somewhere out there?
You're touching on what I think of as the most complex theological issue that I know about. And you know, I was talking about the Middle Ages in this debate about what God's power means, but there was an even more complex debate in the Middle Ages around the concept of omniscience. And what you're getting on kind of touches on that. Like, does God know what we're going to do and then use it? Or does God cause us to act in a certain way first and then know? Like, what's the kind of logical order of the knowledge of God and God's responses? And I can't get into it, the details of this debate, since we're already over by 1 minute. But I will just say that there are some very different views on that. One of the views, for example, one of the ways that people get off on point 3, which, you know, if God is omniscient, then God knows when evil exists, is called open theism. And it's this idea that God does not stand outside of time, but God is actually going through time with us. And God doesn't know what we are going to choose because we have free will. And so God can't have a foreknowledge of that. And so, yes, God is constantly responding, but we can trust that God is able to work it out no matter what happens. This is a view that's espoused, among other people, by a famous pastor named Gregory Boyd, who has some deep connections with the Mennonite Church. So he might be an interesting person. He wouldn't call himself Mennonite, but we ask him to speak at about every other conference we hold. You know, he's a person you could interact with on this. I was drawn to this perspective for a while. But I eventually got more attracted to something called Molinism, or middle knowledge. And I don't even have time to summarize what that means here, but maybe we'll get to that in a later discussion. I think I'm going to give you all a chance to comment, to keep talking here. I mean, we're going to have to end the session soon since it's 3 o'clock, but the conversation doesn't have to end. I just want to say that from my perspective, there's this fine line between answering and not answering this question. And that some people, an actual answer that like tries to say, yeah, God had a reason, and this is that reason, is often called a theodicy. And I try not to engage typically in theodicies, partially because I'm convinced that I don't know, and partially because I think it can be painful for people to have you try to explain away their suffering. But I am drawn to the defense model, which says, look, I will argue, along with someone like Plantinga, that it's not logically inconsistent, that it's not inconceivable to say that God is powerful and knowing and good, and that evil exists. I think that it's logically possible for those to be together. I have no idea how that works, and I'm not going to try to argue for the why, but I have other reasons for having faith, and the logical possibility of it is enough for me to keep going. And there's one more piece for me too that's significant, and this isn't as much, this is a different kind of argument, but it's about the logic of moral outrage. I think that there is an intrinsic desire when we see suffering in the world to be upset about it, to say, this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening. But the problem is that if you lose your faith in God, if you stop believing in God, you're like, oh man, there's all this evil, so there's not a God. Well, then all of a sudden you don't really have a logical basis for being upset about the evil, right? It's inconvenient to you, but you can't really call it evil in an objective sense anymore. So I find I'm grateful to have a God to be mad at, to put it in another way, right? Like, I think there's deep value in being able to have the moral, the strong moral conception of the world that is able to name certain things as evil, and as much tension as it puts on the Christian faith to try to explain how that can work, I'm still grateful for it. So anyway, that's my thought, the thought I'll leave you with on this. Anybody else want to comment? I don't need to keep to belabor this issue, but I do want to recognize that it's 3:05, and if you want to go, you can. You won't offend anybody if you disappear from the conversation.